I heard his voice behind me, a low, almost whispered tone that cut right through me. And I knew immediately, he wasn't just David, he was my stepfather. I spun around sharply, feeling completely exposed. There he was, standing in the doorway, his gaze heavy with unspoken authority and something else I couldn't yet define. I was wearing nothing but his shirt, a shirt that seemed even shorter under the intensity of his stare. My eyes quickly darted to the small box on the bed and then to the piece of red lace lingerie I had carelessly touched minutes earlier. My heart pounded, and I scrambled for words, trying to explain the unintentional act. But before I could speak, he took a measured step forward, closing the distance until only a few centimeters separated us. His eyes locked onto mine with a piercing intensity that made the silence between us nearly unbearable. "Sophie, is this for you?" he asked in a low, controlled tone that made my cheeks burn. His voice was steady, but there was an edge in it that left me uncertain of his true feelings. I tried to answer, to say something that might justify what had happened, but all I managed was a faltering, my voice died away, and I stood there, paralyzed by the moment. Before I could regain my composure, his hand reached out and gently touched the edge of my shirt at my shoulder. In that brief instant, I felt a rush of conflicting sensations, a mix of warmth and a sudden chill that shot through me. I attempted to pull back, but his fingers had already brushed against my skin. His tone softened, yet maintained its firmness, as he said, "Sophie, you can't just leave it like this." Every word struck me hard, and I realized that this was not merely a casual mistake, it was a line that had been crossed. I knew deep down that this moment would change everything. I had never imagined that a single, careless touch could ignite a series of events that would alter the course of my life. The room felt charged, every sound amplified by the tension. I was caught between the urge to escape and an inexplicable pull toward him, a pull I struggled to understand given his role in my life. Every instinct screamed to run, yet another part of me, hidden and desperate for change, wanted to see where this dangerous path would lead. For a long, heavy moment, we stood there in silence. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, my thoughts racing as I tried to process the gravity of what had just happened. The situation was both alarming and strangely compelling. His presence was overwhelming, and his eyes seemed to demand answers I wasn't ready to give. I realized that I was trapped in a situation that would force me to confront emotions I had long kept buried. Then, breaking the heavy silence, he said calmly, "We'll talk about this tomorrow." Those simple words hit me like a cold slap. Without another word, he stepped back and left the room, the sound of the closing door echoing in the stillness. I was left alone with the shock and the implications of our encounter, a moment that I knew would set off a chain reaction I could not ignore. Alone now, I sank onto the edge of the bed, trying to steady my racing thoughts. I replayed the encounter over and over, the sound of his voice, the look in his eyes, and the brief, charged contact of his hand on my shoulder. The sight of the red lace lingerie and the box on the bed loomed large in my mind. I understood that I had crossed a boundary, one that would have consequences far beyond a simple mistake. I forced myself to stand and walked over to the window. Peering out at the dark street below, I tried to clear my head. The quiet hum of distant traffic and the cool night air contrasted sharply with the intensity inside me. I wondered what the next day would bring. Would he be angry, regretful, or simply determined to maintain order in the chaos? The uncertainty was almost unbearable. His parting words, "We'll talk about this tomorrow," echoed in my mind, a promise of difficult conversations and inevitable confrontations. Every moment in that room was heavy with the weight of what had occurred. I had always prided myself on keeping control, on maintaining a clear boundary between right and wrong. Now, that line had been irreversibly blurred. I realized that our encounter was not an isolated lapse, but the spark of something much larger, a dangerous, life-altering shift. As I returned to the bed, I could feel the implications of this event settling in. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, steeling myself for the conversation I knew was coming. The thought of facing him the next day filled me with dread and a strange, forbidden curiosity. My mind raced with questions about the future and the changes that this single moment had set in motion. I knew one thing for certain, nothing in my life would ever be the same. The conversation with my stepfather was inevitable, and I was both terrified and compelled to confront it head-on. I realized that the night's events were just the beginning, a prelude to a series of revelations and decisions that would force me to examine every part of my identity. The next morning, I woke up with the feeling that I was still caught in the whirlwind of last night. I got out of bed and made my way to the kitchen, trying to steady my thoughts. As I entered, I saw David by the sink. He wasn't wearing his shirt, only his sweatpants, and he was drying his hands with a towel. For a few seconds, I froze, watching him move around the small kitchen, until he finally noticed me. His eyes briefly met mine and then roamed over my bare legs. "Good morning," he said in a low tone that made me pause and catch my breath. I quickly grabbed a glass of water from the counter and left the kitchen, hoping to avoid any conversation. I moved down the hall silently, trying to regain control of my scattered thoughts. But it wasn't long before I heard his footsteps behind me. "Sophie, can we talk?" David's voice came from the doorway of my room. He was leaning against the frame, his posture calm yet purposeful. I hesitated and replied, "I don't think there's anything to talk about," even though my voice sounded uncertain and strained. His words, combined with his presence, made it clear that he wasn't going to let the issue fade away. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. His movements were deliberate, slow, and filled with resolve. I stepped back, but my feet hit the edge of the bed, leaving me momentarily stuck. David leaned closer until his hand rested on my wrist. I could feel his steady pressure and the seriousness in his gaze as he said, "I can't forget last night." His eyes were fixed on my lips, and I felt a chill at the intensity of his focus. "David, please, don't," I whispered, trying to push him away. I could feel his fingers slide lightly along my hand, a movement that was both intrusive and charged with an unspoken intensity. His closeness was overwhelming, every second stretched out as I tried to process his words and the weight they carried. Just then, a knock sounded at the door. It was my mom. The sudden interruption broke the charged atmosphere. David quickly released my wrist and stepped back. Without another word, he turned and left the room, closing the door behind him. I was left standing there with my heart pounding and my mind racing, confused by the rapid turn of events. I stood there for a few long moments, trying to understand what had just happened. The abrupt departure of David left me with a mix of relief and uncertainty. I knew that his parting words would linger in my thoughts, and the conversation that was meant to follow remained unspoken. I couldn't tell if he had been trying to force a confrontation or if he was genuinely struggling with what occurred between us last night. The sound of my mom's footsteps outside the door reminded me that I wasn't alone in this situation, yet it also underscored the isolation I felt in handling these emotions. I took a deep breath and moved to sit on the edge of the bed, my mind replaying every moment from the previous evening, the look in his eyes, the contact of his hand, and his insistence on talking about what happened. I felt a burning mix of regret and anxiety about the consequences of our actions. I knew that today would be difficult. The tension from last night had not dissipated, it had merely been pushed aside by the interruption. The unexpected conversation with David was now postponed, leaving me with more questions than answers. What was he truly feeling? Was he angry, regretful, or was there something else behind his calm facade? I also wondered about the implications of his words and the fact that he hadn't let me escape the conversation entirely. As I sat there, I realized that I was at a crossroads. The events of last night were not isolated incidents. They were the start of something that would change the dynamic between us. I wasn't sure if I was ready to confront the reality of that change, but I knew it was inevitable. The tension, the confusion, and the unresolved conversation would eventually demand my attention. I glanced at the door, half expecting David to return, but it remained closed. The silence in the room was heavy and made me more aware of each passing moment. I tried to steady my breathing, reminding myself that I needed to prepare for the conversation that was coming, even if it meant facing difficult truths about what had happened. I reached for my phone to distract myself, scrolling mindlessly for a few minutes. Yet, every notification and every buzz on the screen only reminded me that life outside this room continued, with its own set of complications. The contrast between the normalcy of everyday sounds and the intense personal conflict I was experiencing was stark. The knock at the door had interrupted more than just our conversation, it had interrupted a moment of reckoning. As I sat there, I could sense that the unresolved tension was building. The day was just beginning, and with it came the promise of a confrontation that would force us both to address what had transpired. Even though I was scared, a part of me felt that understanding the truth was necessary, regardless of the consequences. I closed my eyes for a moment and prepared myself for what the day might bring. The lingering words, "I can't forget last night," echoed in my mind, and I knew that this was just the beginning. The conversation was postponed, but it was far from over. A week later, my mom asked me to help David clean out the garage. It was supposed to be a simple, everyday task, but every move felt charged with tension. I wasn't expecting anything more than a routine chore, yet the atmosphere was far from normal. I found myself standing on a ladder, reaching for a box on a high shelf. I had just stretched out my arm when I suddenly felt his hands on my thighs. His grip held me in place, and I froze. I could tell by the firmness in his tone that this was not an accident. "Careful, don't fall," he said. His words were meant to be a warning, but there was a hint in his voice that made me pause even longer. I couldn't tell if he was genuinely concerned or if there was another motive behind his actions. My heart pounded in my chest, and I struggled to focus on the task at hand. I managed to retrieve the box and slowly began descending the ladder. As I reached the ground, I noticed that David was standing very close to me. His presence felt overwhelming, and I became acutely aware of every small movement between us. His fingers brushed lightly along my arm as he guided me away from the ladder, and a cold shiver ran down my skin. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, not daring to look up, trying to ignore the charged energy that filled the space. The rest of the garage work passed in an uneasy silence. I organized tools and moved boxes while David directed some of the cleaning tasks. Every so often, our hands would accidentally touch, and I would feel that same prickling sensation. I couldn't shake the feeling that the innocent chore had turned into something far more complicated. After we finished cleaning, I returned home, still processing the events in the garage. The tension I felt earlier lingered with me as the day went on. I tried to focus on my routine, but my mind kept replaying every detail of what had happened. I felt unsettled, knowing that nothing could be left unsaid or unresolved. That evening, I decided to take a shower to help clear my mind and relieve the physical tension that had built up. I stepped into the bathroom, turned on the water, and let it run over my body, hoping that the warmth would ease my troubled thoughts. As I closed my eyes and tried to relax, the sound of the bathroom door creaking reached my ears. I turned and saw a dark silhouette behind the frosted glass of the shower door. It was David. I froze. His unexpected presence in the bathroom was not something I had anticipated or wanted. He seemed to be standing there casually, as if it were perfectly normal for him to be in my space. "It's hot in here. I'll probably fix the fan," he said, his tone flat and matter-of-fact. His statement was meant to be an excuse, but I knew it wasn't valid. He wasn't supposed to be here at all. I could sense that his explanation was a cover for something more intrusive. I quickly turned my attention back to the water, letting it run over me as I tried to process the situation. The tension from earlier in the day resurfaced with renewed force. Every drop of water seemed to echo the uneasy feeling in my stomach. I was left with a mix of anger, confusion, and a deep sense of violation. In that moment, I realized that what had begun as an innocent request to help with the garage had escalated into something much more disturbing. As the water continued to fall, I braced myself for what was coming next, knowing that this was not the end of our unresolved conflict. When Mom went on a business trip for a few days, everything changed. David stayed at home, and his presence became even more noticeable. The house felt different without Mom around, and I found myself more alone with David's constant proximity. I wasn't sure how to adjust to the new normal, but I tried to keep to my routine. One evening, as the day wound down, David suggested we have a glass of wine together. I agreed, thinking that a little wine might help me relax after the tension of the past few days. We settled on the living room sofa, a quiet space with minimal distractions. The conversation started off as small talk about the day's events and the weather, but there was an undercurrent of something unspoken in his tone. As we talked, I noticed David's hand slowly moving closer to mine. Before I could register it, his hand had slipped onto my leg. His fingers moved gently along my skin. I felt a mix of emotions, confusion, discomfort, and a reluctant curiosity. I knew that what was happening was not something I had planned, yet I couldn't deny that it stirred feelings inside me that I had been trying to ignore. "You know there's something between us," David said quietly, leaning closer so that his lips were only a few centimeters away from mine. His voice was calm but carried an intensity that made my heart beat faster. For a moment, the air between us was charged with the unspoken truth of our situation. I felt a surge of panic as I realized the implications of his proximity. I stood up abruptly, trying to put distance between us. My heart pounded in my chest as I moved toward the door, desperate to escape the situation. But before I could take another step, David reached out and took hold of my hand. "Sophie, you feel it too. Don't be afraid," he whispered, his tone low and persuasive. His hand tightened around mine as if to anchor me in place. I could sense the determination in his eyes, and it made me hesitate. Part of me recognized the undeniable attraction between us, while another part was alarmed by the risk we were taking. In that tense moment, his other hand slid to my waist. I felt a wave of warmth spread through me, a physical response that was confusing and unsettling. The sensation was both intimate and invasive. I struggled internally, torn between wanting to run and feeling trapped by the intensity of the moment. Every instinct in me screamed that this was wrong, yet the situation was unfolding so quickly that I couldn't find the words to stop it. Realizing that I needed to assert control over the situation, I mustered all my strength and pulled my hand away from his grasp. "I'm tired," I said firmly, stepping back. My voice was steady despite the turmoil inside me. I needed to regain my space, to remind myself that I was in charge of my own boundaries. David looked momentarily taken aback, his eyes narrowing as if he was processing my rejection. Without another word, I turned and walked away from the living room. I made my way to my room, closing the door behind me, and sat on the edge of my bed. The cool silence of my room provided a stark contrast to the heated tension I had just experienced. I replayed the events in my head, trying to understand what had just happened and why it had escalated so quickly. I was aware that the situation was far from resolved. David's actions, his words, and the lingering physical contact had all contributed to a charged atmosphere that I knew would not disappear on its own. I felt conflicted. Part of me was deeply disturbed by the violation of my personal space, while another part could not ignore the undeniable pull between us. The line between desire and discomfort had blurred, leaving me uncertain about my next steps. In that quiet moment, I realized that this was not just an isolated incident, but the beginning of something that would complicate our relationship even further. The conversation we had avoided was now inevitable. I knew that tomorrow, or sooner rather than later, David would bring up what had happened, and I would have to confront the consequences. I sat in silence for a long while, grappling with my thoughts and emotions. The unresolved tension filled the room, and I felt both anxious and resigned. I understood that avoiding the issue would only make it worse. The feeling of warmth from his touch still lingered on my skin, a reminder of the brief moment of vulnerability we had shared. As I tried to steady my breathing, I promised myself that I would not let the situation spiral out of control. I needed to be clear about my boundaries and decide what I was willing to accept. I knew that the events of that evening would have lasting consequences, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for them. Yet, even as I resolved to put some distance between us, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The tension in the room was a prelude to further complications, and the conversation with David was far from over. I braced myself for what the coming days might bring, knowing that our unresolved conflict would soon demand a confrontation that I was both dreading and expecting. With that thought, I sat quietly, awaiting the inevitable fallout as the night deepened outside my window. In the middle of the night, I woke to the unmistakable feeling of another presence in the room. My eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness, and I saw David sitting on the edge of my bed. His expression was serious as he regarded me in the dim light. There was an intensity in his gaze that left little room for uncertainty. "I can't ignore this anymore," he said softly, reaching out to take my hand. His fingers traced a deliberate path along my wrist, moving steadily toward my shoulder. I felt the warmth of his touch, and despite my inner turmoil, I couldn't completely deny the desire it stirred. His hand seemed to communicate a mix of longing and determination, drawing me in even as I fought to keep control. David shifted his position, drawing closer until his body was almost touching mine. His quiet words and measured movements left no doubt that he wanted more than what had been left unsaid between us for so long. I sensed that he was testing the boundaries of our unspoken agreement, trying to see if the connection between us was as real and powerful as I had feared, and secretly hoped it was. He leaned in further, his lips hovering just above mine. The nearness of his face sent a jolt of conflicting emotions through me. Part of me was overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment, and I felt a pull that was as irresistible as it was dangerous. Even as I fought internally, I realized that I wanted to be close to him, to feel his warmth and the secure intimacy he offered. But at the same time, a nagging voice in my head reminded me of the consequences of this forbidden closeness. David's hand continued its slow, deliberate journey as he whispered, "Sophie, you feel it too. Don't be afraid." His words were calm and measured, but every syllable carried the weight of a promise. I could feel his steady grip as his hand slid down toward my waist, and my body responded instinctively, betraying the conflict I tried so hard to suppress. For a few long moments, time seemed to slow. The space between us had shrunk to almost nothing as we lingered in that charged silence. My skin still tingled under his touch, and despite my reservations, a part of me was drawn into the intimacy he was offering. I could feel the heat from his body and the quiet insistence in his eyes, which made it hard to say no. The desire was palpable, and in that suspended moment, I almost forgot all the rules I had set for myself. Yet, even as the pull of desire grew stronger, the reality of our situation loomed large in my mind. I had always known that this connection was dangerous. It was as if every touch and every whispered word came with an unspoken cost. I struggled to reconcile the conflicting parts of myself, the part that longed for his touch and the part that knew that this was crossing a line from which there was no return. Then, as his lips brushed tantalizingly close to mine, I felt an overwhelming surge of conflicting emotions. The closeness, the intensity, and the forbidden nature of our encounter all collided in one moment. In a sudden, desperate bid to regain control, I pushed him away. Tears welled up in my eyes as I managed to pull back, my voice barely a whisper as I said, "No, David. This is wrong." For several heartbeats, he stared at me, his expression unreadable in the faint light. The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. I could see the conflict in his eyes, a mix of longing, disappointment, and something else I couldn't quite decipher. It was clear that he felt the intensity of our connection as deeply as I did, yet he too was aware of the boundaries we were not meant to cross. Without a word, David stood up and moved to the door. The soft click of the closing door punctuated the space between us, leaving me alone with the aftermath of our encounter. In that quiet, charged moment, I realized that nothing could go back to the way it had been. We had crossed a line, and the repercussions were now inevitable. I sat there on the edge of the bed, my heart racing and my mind filled with a whirlwind of emotions. The memory of his touch, the warmth of his hands, and the intensity of his gaze remained with me, lingering like a bittersweet echo. I knew that despite my rejection, a part of me had craved every moment of that intimacy, even if it was forbidden. The stark reality was that our connection was now irrevocable. I understood that our lives would never return to normal. The intimacy we had shared, the brief moments of vulnerability and desire, had opened a door that could not be closed. In that final moment, as I sat alone in the darkness, I made a silent promise to myself. I would have to face the consequences of what had happened, no matter how complicated and painful they might be. That night taught me a difficult truth. I no longer could remain in a state of denial. I had allowed myself to be drawn into a dangerous game of desire and restraint. And though part of me still wanted him, wanted the closeness, the thrill of our secret connection, I knew that the cost was too high. As I sat there, trying to steady my breathing and gather my thoughts, I realized that everything had changed. We had crossed a line, and now our future was shrouded in uncertainty. There was no turning back, and the consequences of our actions would ripple through every part of our lives from this moment forward. In the silence of that night, as I looked at the closed door, I understood that our relationship would never be the same again. The intensity of our shared moment, the physical closeness, and the raw desire we both felt had set in motion a chain of events that could not be undone. And though I was filled with both longing and regret, I also recognized that I had reached a turning point, a point of no return. The finality of that moment, when I pushed him away, marked the end of our innocence and the beginning of a complicated, irrevocable reality.